Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Hi, I'm Samm Deighan, a writer and film historian, and I'm excited to discuss Gorod Zero, or Zerograd, also known as Zero City, Karen Sheknazarov's 1989 absurdist satire. That is such a fascinating film to talk about for so many reasons, but I think mainly because you can really look at it as being such a specific product of its time and place. And I'll talk more about what that means as I go along, but basically this is the sort of film that never would have been allowed to be made a few years before this because of the way that Soviet censorship worked. And it's really a brilliant satire of bureaucracy in general, but specifically of Soviet bureaucracy in this period where the Soviet Union was really coming to its end. But the thing that makes it so fascinating to watch today, and I definitely want to talk a lot more about this later on, is this idea that the things the film is criticizing or satirizing are really prescient today as well in some alarming and amusing ways. And so I want to talk about those parallels at the same time. But it's also a film that I think is really worthy of rediscovery. It was intended to be the Soviet entry at the Academy Awards that year, but was passed over. And it's something that I think a lot of English language audiences are not familiar with, but will absolutely love. And this was recently restored by Mosfilm, who are one of the oldest, most important Russian film studios, and so I want to talk about their history as well, particularly in terms of the way it relates to Sheknazarov's career. So, after being a director for a number of years in the late 90s, he wound up becoming Director General of Mosfilm, and I think is a really critical figurehead in the way that the studio has started to focus on restoring and preserving and promoting some of the great films in Mosfilm's history. And so I just want to talk about the connection between all of those things, its definite connection to absurdist literature and the influence of writers like Gogol and Kafka, and how satire kind of functions as a form of resistance, and is also something that often I think feels really relevant regardless of when you're watching a particular film. And what's so great about this, and I think what makes it accessible for a wide variety of audiences and also kind of a good starting point for later Russian and later Soviet cinema, is the fact that it isn't just a dark, depressing movie like a lot of absurdist satire can be. I mean, it certainly has those components, but part of it also dips into murder mystery territory, but it's also an absurdist comedy in a lot of ways, and strikes this really interesting balance between being a more serious-toned film with moments of dread and suspense, and also being something a lot more lighthearted. And of course, we're throughout following this engineer, this sort of average, everyday kind of civil servant type figure from Moscow named Alexei Varekin, played wonderfully by Leonid Filatov, and I'll talk about Filatov's career more a little bit later, who comes to this unnamed small town, presumably in the middle of nowhere, for a business trip, and pretty much from the moment he gets there, finds things increasingly strange, finds that he's pretty much trapped there for a variety of reasons, And his character is such a good example of what you might think of as the sort of typical absurdist everyman character, who's an interesting balance between being kind of stubborn and at the same time passive. And that passivity and that sort of reliance on politeness and other kinds of social mores wind up getting him into this situation where he's sort of convinced of things and talked into things and has his reality challenged and even his own identity. And those elements, which are such a crucial, central component of this film, also show up in so much other absurdist literature. I mean, I think most people, at least most Americans watching this film, probably will think first of the works of Franz Kafka, and I do want to talk more about those themes a little bit later on, but it's such a standard of absurdist literature in general, from Russians like Dostoevsky, definitely to Kafka, who was a Czech writer, in the way that it takes this kind of average, ordinary person and puts them in these strange and extraordinary situations and watches as they kind of go a little bit mad. And it doesn't come to those sorts of extremes here, but there are some real similarities between something like Kafka's The Trial, or even more so The Castle, and Zerograd, where you have this person who's just sort of swept up into this strange situation. And the way that it starts off here at the beginning is kind of like The Castle, in the sense that he's an outsider coming to a new place for work-related reasons. And so he's not a foreigner, so things are still familiar to him. The language is the same, and so on and so forth. He's in his own country. But what starts off as kind of a mildly frustrating situation quickly takes a bizarre turn here when he's finally given his appointment and shows up to the boss's office to find his secretary stark naked, typing away, doing her work like nothing at all has happened. And I think that's why it's important to have this other guy come out of the office and be totally nonplussed by her nudity. And the naked secretary here is played by Yelena Arjanek, and her utter straight face about it is just so wonderful. This is definitely the moment, just a couple minutes into the film, where things do take a turn towards the surreal and the absurd. And there's a lot about this film, and I'll talk about this as we go, but there's a lot about this film that feels weirdly prescient, like it's responding to current events rather than solely events in the late 80s. And this scene here reminds me a lot of this Russian news show called The Naked Truth, Golaya Pravda, which was this TV program that came about a decade after this film, that started in the late 90s, early 2000s, basically when Russian producers and TV networks were kind of desperate to get more viewers. And what they did was, in the case of The Naked Truth, they had the host, the journalist sort of leading the news program, played by Svetlana Pesotskaya. They had her stripped down while reading the news, and, sometimes there would be a pair of hands covering up her breasts. I think in other shows they had people who stripped completely, and it became sort of a joke, but a serious way to get more viewers to pay attention to the news, and wound up becoming so wildly popular that, politicians were dying to come on to be interviewed. And I think this balance of comedy and the absurd that something like The Naked Truth captured shows up so clearly here in this sequence. And part of what's so great about it is the boss of the factory is so serious. He also seems kind of exhausted by the whole thing. Like, he wants to get Verikin what he's there for, but he's just sort of, too busy to be bothered is the vibe he gives off. And this actor is Armen Jigarkanyan, who's a really, really famous Soviet and Armenian and, now Russian actor who has a background in the theater, but starting in the 70s went on to just become wildly popular. And that's something that you'll hear me say a lot throughout this commentary as I talk about the film, is just so many of the people involved in making this are, hugely important in Soviet cinema, Russian cinema, and a lot of them have been given awards and recognized by the state and things like that. I mean, Jigarkanyan has been in hundreds of films in seemingly every single genre. He had popular TV roles, and so I think he is a really recognizable face, definitely now, but also in the 80s as well. He's somebody who taught at the state film school and, as I said, was a really important player in Soviet theater as well, and is just such a distinguished performer. I think if you're a fan of Soviet cinema or Russian cinema, you should definitely recognize his face. But his use of comedy is so great here, that straight face, that he seems to not quite believe that the secretary is naked, but also doesn't really seem that surprised or put out by it, and he just doesn't care and sort of wants to get business over. And because he is this really kind of stable presence, he sort of acts as this subtly disruptive force for Verikin, where he doesn't do anything totally out of the ordinary. He's, not exaggerated or over the top in any way. He just acts like everything that's going on is totally business as usual, and gives off this kind of stately, assured authority in his presence here, which I think is pretty typical of some of his roles. So I should also talk about Leonid Filatov, who's another really well-known actor, obviously incredibly talented, as you can see from this film. Got his start as a Soviet actor, although he went to film school in the 60s and intended to be a director, which was sort of redirected, didn't work out the way he wanted to, but he became a really celebrated actor both on stage and on screen, and eventually was able to direct films. He also worked as a poet and was part of a pretty well-known theater troupe, and is yet another person in this film who won tons of awards. He was named People's Artist of Russia, which is a pretty important government distinction. And I think part of what makes him great in this film, like so many of the other people involved in it, is that classical stage background. I mean, much like Jigarkanyan, he's somebody who worked on sort of classic literature and theatrical adaptations, both in terms of a broader kind of Western theatrical repertory, but also some really important Russian texts like Chekhov plays, things like adaptations of The Master and the Margarita, and Mikhail Bulgakov is one of those absurdist, satirical Russian authors who I think had kind of an obvious influence on some of the themes of this film. And, Filatov went on to be a playwright in his own right, and in 1990, just after this film, he directed this movie called Sons of Bitches, where, he wrote the film, directed it, has a supporting role, and some of the other actors who I'll talk about when we get to them also went on to appear in that film. So I think a lot of the people here wound up working together pretty regularly as well. And part of what makes him so great here is, when you think about it, he does relatively little, but is such a powerful kind of facial expression actor that even though he doesn't have a whole lot to say and he doesn't have a particularly expressive personality, he's able to convey so much incredulity in this kind of passive, polite way that makes him such an effective everyman. And, I think a really central component to a lot of absurdist stories is this idea that the rights and opinions and even the reality of the central protagonist are gradually encroached upon. It doesn't start off that way dramatically from the beginning, but there is this reality shift, and strange things start to happen at the beginning of this. Like, we have this sequence here where he orders his meal, and then the waiter kind of turns people away and starts to shut down the restaurant, even though he's still being served. And I should mention that the waiter is played by Yuri Sherstonov, who is another Russian actor known for some of his roles, particularly in the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of the way that these kinds of absurdist scenes are set up is based on some sort of interaction between the protagonist and kind of a regular person, either in an office or working in a restaurant, as here, because so much of it is all about disrupting social conventions. And I think in a lot of absurdist narratives, things like your basic requests, your opinions, your desires are denied in these kinds of gradual stages. And eventually your reality, your identity, things that you know to be true about the world are also denied. And as I was kind of suggesting earlier, in a lot of absurdist literature, this is originally accepted by the protagonist because it starts off in such gradual stages. The person is maybe kind of passive and timid, or maybe they're just polite and they're focused on business, as Zerograd is here. And they're usually reluctant to push back because of these kinds of deeply ingrained social mores. They don't want to seem rude or rock the boat, and in this kind of strange bureaucracy, they're gradually encroached upon. But here, it's just one of my favorite scenes in the movie. I mean, he says he doesn't want dessert, and not only does he have dessert forced upon him, but he gets his own head as a cake, which is just wonderful. And, Shekhnazarov in an interview mentioned that he had trouble finding somebody to make a convincing head cake, but it looks absolutely gorgeous, and it also gives it these kind of mild body horror vibes that you get such a realistic version of his head baked into a cake. Meanwhile, this hidden jazz band starts playing as if to accompany the unveiling and cutting of the cake with some sort of musical fanfare. It's just such an incredible scene, and he looks sort of horrified and repulsed all at the same time, and these glass eyes in the cake really put it over the edge. But it's even more absurd because of this dialogue where the waiter says to him, the chef has really taken a liking to you and baked this cake specially for you. But he's only been in the restaurant for a few minutes. So it's incredible to think that someone would be able to bake an entire cake in that short an amount of time and have it be such an accurate likeness. And this dialogue here where he tells him, if you don't at least try this cake, the chef is going to kill himself. And Zerograd, of course, is outraged and throws his money down and goes to leave. And that fast, the chef does indeed kill himself. And certainly within a lot of absurdist literature. I mean, I think the standard that so many English language people are introduced to is Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Often you have these strange things happening to bodies, and these moments of kind of inexplicable sudden violence, like this suicide that happens pretty much out of nowhere, and definitely takes sort of a horrifying turn. And Verikin is really quickly drawn into this investigation, which he thinks, and as viewers we think, should just be the investigation of a suicide of someone who clearly is psychologically disturbed in some way. But the prosecutor puts a whole different spin on it and kind of tries to blame Verikin a little bit with this line here where he says, you know, he warned you that if you didn't eat a piece of the cake, he was going to kill himself, and talks about how maybe that this is a whole different situation and it could be a murder and not just this kind of simple cut and dried suicide. And a lot of this film is really about the distortion of reality, distortion of history, events being totally spun out of control based on somebody's perception or even their imagined perception of the situation, which is totally what happens here with the prosecutor. And I should mention that the prosecutor, the actor playing the prosecutor, Vladimir Menshov, is another really well-known figure in Soviet and Russian theater and cinema. He's an actor, passed away last year, but also was well-known as a director. And even though he doesn't quite play the role here, he did play some of those everyman characters. And I think his role as a prosecutor is sort of a variation on that. Because much like the factory boss at the beginning of the film, he's not really doing anything too unusual or out of the ordinary. He's just sort of presenting things to Verikin like, yes, of course it's a totally reasonable possibility that maybe this is a murder, and maybe, even though you don't think you're involved and you say you've never met the chef, maybe you're really the reason that he died. And his ability to have such a straight face and kind of an earnest argument about what actually happened is part of what makes the absurdity and the comedy so effective. And, you know, Menshov is somebody who also started off working early in his career through the Moscow Art Theater School. He served as an assistant director really early on at yet another theater troupe, and started off in the 70s working with film studios like Mosfilm and Odessa Film, and is in well over 100 films, including into the 2000s, some movies that became pretty popular with Western audiences like Night Watch, the vampire horror movie. He also directed a film that got a lot of acclaim and became really popular called Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears. He's another one who was recognized by the Soviet Union and awarded all of these different state prizes, and became kind of a junior senior director in Mosfilm, heading this subsidiary company called Film Studio Genre. He was given the Order of Merit, and so on and so forth. And his determination to turn this strange suicide into a murder investigation definitely adds a mystery component to this film that's really interesting, and of course is never really resolved. But what I think is so amazing about it is, unlike in some of Kafka's stories, for example, Verikin doesn't just accept that he's being forced into this investigation and, you know, he's asked to not leave town. His determination to escape, which, you know, is not fruitful, sort of leads him down this rabbit hole in which all of the town's citizens seem complicit in some sort of conspiracy. And I love this transitional point in the film because him wandering around through this dark forest when he's been asked to have the taxi driver take him to the nearest train station almost gives it this kind of fairy tale component because he's taken out of this sort of industrialized part of the city that looks like an urban center. It has factories and hotels and so on and so forth. And instead, he's kind of wandering in this dark forest and stumbles across the old train station, which, as we come to learn, is no longer functioning, and instead houses this wonderfully bizarro museum that is really the centerpiece of the film in terms of the set pieces, and also gives you such a clear idea of what the central kind of themes of Zerograd are. This sequence here where he sees the train station, covered in ivy, it really reminds me of something like Hansel and Gretel wandering through the forest alone with nowhere else to go, and they stumble across this kind of inviting-looking witch's cabin. And it isn't quite as horrifying as that, but very nearly. Although before we get too much further, I do just want to talk a little bit more about Mosfilm, which, as I said, is one of the oldest and most important film studios in Russian history. As a film historian, usually I find myself talking about it as being an important Soviet film studio, though of course it continued well after 1989 and 1990, and it was founded in the 20s. And is a really crucial part of the way that the Soviet Union prioritized film production and what they wanted it to be as a reflection of Soviet values. And even despite those restrictions, or maybe because of them, and when I talk a little bit more about the ways that this film deviates from conventional Soviet cinema, I'll talk more about this later, but they were responsible for producing and creating some of the most important films in Soviet cinema history and just some of the most influential films in general. I mean, Sergei Eisenstein and Andrei Tarkovsky made films there. Things like The Cranes Are Flying and Ballad of a Soldier, Larissa Shepitko's Wings. If you're a fan of horror films, the beloved Witch movie V. They made, the Akira Kurosawa co-production Dersu Usala, and so many films that were not only important to the Soviet Union at the time, but that have gone on to become really influential, beloved films around the world. And they made thousands of films throughout their history as a Soviet studio, but I think their focus now, in addition to making contemporary films, is really to preserve and promote the history of Soviet cinema. And Karen Shekhnazarov, as, basically the head director and head of the studio, is really instrumental in kind of deciding which films in their archive should be restored and released to a wide audience, which historically is so important, and I think it's wonderful that it's a big part of their mission. And, some of that is about promoting the importance of Russian culture, but Russian cinema has, historically, some really incredibly important directors and important works. And so I think it's great that that has become part of their mission post, mid-90s, where whole sections of the studio you can tour and it's kind of treated as a museum. And so it's just fascinating the way that they've sort of pivoted a little bit to be not just about making new films, but in really working to protect and preserve important old films. And this really, as I was saying, is such an important sequence in this movie because it really gives you an idea of what the core themes of the film are all about. And while we're in the middle of this section where, he's sucked into what may or may not be a murder mystery, and because of it, he's not allowed to leave town, he tries anyway, which sort of redirects him on this accidental adventure that takes a turn into the very strange and very surreal here in this sequence when he gets to the museum. And this scene here in the underground museum was sort of the original core idea that Shagnazarov had that led to the writing of the script and thus the creation of the entire film. And basically what's going on here is that this museum curator, this sort of tour guide, played by Yevgeny Yevstigneyev, who is yet again another really important Soviet and Russian actor who has a long career in theater and in cinema. He founded his own theatrical troupe, Savremenik, and is another one who was given the honor of People's Artist of the USSR in the 80s. And he's actually in a bunch of the films I mentioned not too long ago that Mosfilm made, like Ballad of a Soldier and Wings, and is just in a ton of films up to the early 90s. And if you're a fan of cinema, you should really recognize his face. He actually went on to work with Filatov when Filatov directed that film I mentioned called Sons of Bitches. But the whole purpose of this sequence here is basically he's talking about these theatrical versions of real historical sequences. So none of this is made up. He's just putting such a strange, dramatic spin on it. And this idea of distorting history and distorting facts is so key to the film's satire. And this idea of rewriting history and rewriting facts under totalitarian governments is something that happened in so many countries, not just in the Soviet Union, but, decades earlier, Nazi Germany was guilty of it. And even on a slightly different level, in non-totalitarian governments, most of the countries of Europe did this after World War II as a way to kind of shift focus on their role in the war. So, for example, a country like France, where a relatively small percentage of the population was actually involved fighting the resistance, after the war, so many people came out and talked about their role in the resistance and how they were always against the Nazis, which is not true at all. And I think you hear this a lot in general about the idea of the way that history is told as a story. There's this idea that the quote-unquote winner is the one who gets to write history. And that's another example of this, of the way that history is distorted. And so, as I said, everything depicted here technically does represent a factual moment in history with these sort of comedic distortions that serve to increase the importance of this town, some of its individuals, or just in a general sense to make Russian history seem like it has this inflated global importance, like it's the center of the universe, and all these important things that have happened throughout history, in all these different countries and all these different civilizations, in some way relate back to this specific area in Russia. And Shagnazarov has talked about this in interviews and said, the essence of Zerograd is this idea that a person mythologizes history and distorts it. And in constantly distorting history, distorts his own life. And so basically his argument is that we don't know what history really is because there's always some kind of spin put on it for us. And pretty much every country does this. I mean, as somebody who grew up in the United States being taught history from textbooks, as a child, that's certainly true. There's this distortion put on the role of the US government in things like genocide against indigenous peoples and slavery and racism towards African Americans and black people. And so it really is something that happens widely, but this version that we're getting here in Zerograd, I think, is pretty unique to the Soviet Union and the way in which they would often, especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s, would often totally rewrite history and deny that certain things happened or insist upon this official version of the truth. And I think what's so fascinating about this film and the way it feels really prescient is if you look at what's going on in the world currently, you have this happening again. I mean, in the United States, conservative politicians like Donald Trump have this way of kind of denying facts and saying whatever they want to say and presenting these sort of versions of the truth and versions of history and factual events that are wildly different from day to day in this way that's incredibly destabilizing. Certainly someone like Vladimir Putin in Russia does something similar and will only allow certain versions of the news and certain interpretations by writers to be allowed to become public. And that type of censorship is definitely something that I think a lot of people associate with totalitarian governments like the Soviet Union. And here you're really seeing a kind of comedic version of that that also feels really eerie and tragic at the same way. And part of what's so surrealistic about this sequence is, as I think most people can identify, there's something very strange about wax museums and these kinds of historical tableaux that are created to mimic or reenact real historical events. And wax figures have what Freud describes as this kind of uncanny effect, where it's close to reality, but something about it is just not quite right. And here, there's even a further spin on that, because these figures, which you can tell so beautifully in this gorgeous restoration of the film, these are not wax figures, which I'm sure would have been colossally expensive to produce, but they're actors in a ton of makeup who basically are just forced to stand completely still during these sequences. And Varikin's face throughout this scene is just wonderful. He seems sort of horrified and shocked into silence. Like he can't really argue with the museum host, but he just doesn't know what to say, and it is a lot to take in. The way he kind of blends these different stories about, real historical figures combined with events from the town and making it seem like the town is just critical to global history. It's very funny. And this is a film where I think it stresses the ways in which bureaucratic rules are ridiculous, but also the ways in which storytelling, which is such a crucial component of human society and human identity, can be skewed to some very dangerous ends, which is certainly something, as I keep saying, that happened a lot throughout the history of the Soviet Union. And in this part of the film, but definitely starting off from its opening scenes, there's this sense that nobody knows quite what is real. And I don't think I would describe this as an overtly surrealistic film or a fantasy film, because what's so interesting about it is that it is grounded in reality. There's nothing really supernatural that happens, nothing that seems to bend the laws of physics. it's grounded in the real, but just presents this sort of bizarre take on that. Like, there's nothing about it that's too out of the ordinary, but it's just strange enough to feel really disorienting, both for Verikin's character and for an audience member watching the film. Is you're made to question again and again, is this a film steeped in realism? Are we about to learn that maybe this is something like magic realism, where 80% of it follows the rules of conventional reality, but it sort of veers off? And you never get a conclusive answer to that, which I think is so wonderful and makes it feel just so comedic in this really kind of dark, eerie way that I absolutely love, and I think makes it so effective as a work of satire. So one of the things I do want to talk about more is Shekhnazharov's career overall. And so he really started directing films mostly in the early 80s and worked as a producer and a screenwriter, and of course, as I said, became Director General of Mosfilm in the late 90s. But he really got his start making some films that I think have themes in common with Zerograd for sure. So, for example, in 1984, he made this musical comedy called We Are From Jazz, which is all about this student who loves jazz. It's set historically in the 20s, and he gets kicked out of music school because of that interest. So there are definitely some parallels to Zerograd, where you have this kind of more rebellious character who loves this particular musical aspect of American culture and is ostracized because of it. And there are also elements of Zerograd that I think mimic musicals, especially this museum sequence, the way that you have all of these kind of tableaux and how they're set up. Some of them are kind of interactive and moving, much like that jazz band sequence earlier in the film when he's at the restaurant. And so there are definitely some parallels from that early film. He will go on to make a musical about a tap dancer called Winter Evening in Gagra from 1985. One of his earliest sort of prize-winning films is this movie called Courier, which is sometimes known as The Messenger Boy in English, from 1987, that won a bunch of prizes and definitely brought him some acclaim. And I think because of the success, the relative success he found with Zerograd, at least also the freedom to make it, I think inspired him to go on to make some other absurdist films and absurdist comedies. You have something like Assassin of the Tsar from 91, which unusually stars the great British actor Malcolm McDowell, who was sort of dubbed over in Russian. And it's a historical film about the final days of the Romanov family. And McDowell plays this character who is in an asylum and says that, he was the person who officially killed the Tsar and the heir to Nicholas II. And it sort of, I think, is also a different version of this idea of distorting history and rewriting history and how that ties into personal narrative. He followed that up with Dreams from 1993, which is another historical film about Russia on the verge of revolution. That's also an absurdist comedy. In 2001, he made Poisons or the World History of Poisoning, which is also an absurdist comedy. And so I think he clearly has some themes that he would return to again and again in different ways as a director. And He has this really fascinating bio up on the Mosfilm site that I just want to read a little bit of. Because I think, unlike a lot of American or British directors, he's not known just for directing his own films and writing and producing, but also for the specific role he plays at Mosfilm and the way that he's kind of become a steward of Russian culture and Russian cinema. So the bio says he's one of the leading masters of the Russian cinema, a heightened sense of modernity, an ability to highlight the most important details of time, to entertain the audience, and at the same time to make it think and empathize. These are the key features of his films. They are well known both to Russian and foreign film viewers. Also, they're the winners of prestigious awards at film showcases and festivals. And so this idea of the bio emphasizing this heightened sense of modernity and this focus on empathy, I think you see that a lot in Zerograd, and it's maybe why it feels warmer and funnier than a lot of other absurdist films I can think of. But I think there are also some broader questions that you have to ask about the development of his career and the way that his later role in Russian cinema maybe contrasts or conflicts with his role as the director of this film. And, obviously this is an absurdist satire that looks at these issues of a totalitarian Soviet government's tendency to rewrite history and to encourage its citizens in a way to do the same thing. And so I think you have to ask, is there a conflict between a director who creates this piece of art that's all about social satire and is basically a work of dissent? And as I said, he has films to follow this that would do the same thing. His first musical that, looks at this character who is obsessed with American jazz music and gets in trouble because of it. Is that personality at odds with this idea of a government official, which he now is, and a government-sanctioned artist? And do those two things go together? Is it a natural growth of someone's career? And I feel like that's important to think about when you watch this film in terms of the film's themes and the way they relate to 1989 in the Soviet Union versus the way those films seem really relevant today, and certainly the role of Russia in politics today. And I think it's also really important to point out that Zerograd would have been forbidden during much of the Soviet Union's history. And it's really this particular window in the late 80s, this period of perestroika, which I'll talk about more a little bit, that allowed him to get away with making this film because the Russian government sort of realized the way that things have been going are not working, and we're going to ease up on things like censorship. And so that's why, I keep sort of getting around this issue that this sort of critical satire was not at all acceptable during most of the decades of cinema under the Soviet Union. And so to watch a film like this from the end of the Soviet Union, from the late 80s, and see it as this really funny, smart, surrealistic, absurdist satire, I think probably for a lot of American audiences, it's a little bit hard to square with what Americans are taught about Russians and Russian society and permissiveness during the Soviet Union. And so I think it's this really interesting counterexample of something that younger directors did have a window to do during this period. And it's just fascinating to me on a different level that Shekhnazarov could make a film like this. And certainly when it came out, it had fans in Russia, fans in other countries, also detractors who didn't like how critical it was of the Soviet Union. But it's just fascinating that he rose so high while making this kind of art. because I think we really associate issues with freedom of speech and freedom of expression in Russia under the Soviet Union, but also today under a leader like Vladimir Putin, who certainly does not welcome criticism or dissent very often, and who is a great proponent of rewriting history to suit his own aims, which is something that the world is struggling with right now. And I also think it's important to give a little more context about Soviet cinema history to get an idea of the tradition that a film like Zerograd came out of.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
So from very early on, I would say the Soviet government thought that cinema was going to be an important tool as a way to share their values, educate their citizens, and things like that. And certainly they're not the only country to feel that way. And definitely during the early years of the Soviet Union and the period between World War I and World War II and the time around World War II, a lot of countries, definitely the US as well, and Germany also, would use cinema in such a specific way where even when they were making films in various genres and not just documentaries or newsreels, they would always have some sort of propagandistic component to them. But the Soviet Union really had this kind of monopoly on cinema, and everything had to pass these really rigorous censorship laws and systems that they had in place for the majority of their history. And most of the films that were made during the early decades of the Soviet Union are known as socialist realism. And so that is very different from something you may have heard of called social realism. And what social realism does is it usually focuses on dramas and plots like that, maybe melodrama, that tries to depict society in an accurate way. So it shows things like class tensions and poverty and sexism and racism, and is in a lot of ways grounded in reality, especially the less pleasant aspects of reality. Socialist realism is a totally different thing. There basically could be nothing negative depicted in socialist realism, and it pretty much existed to show people the glory of communism and what the ideal Soviet citizen would be like. And so you have, from very early on, Lenin and then later Stalin, who emphasized the importance of cinema and this idea of the importance of the right kind of cinema that goes along with party aims. So they had control over everything, not just from the script writing process through to film production, but also people who owned cinemas and were screening movies and, renting films out for any kind of public or private consumption. And so this sort of set up this system as, and this, I especially wanted to talk about this because I think it's so important to the broader themes of Zerograd. So Zerograd has this idea that, this chef who has killed himself, you learn that as a young man, he was really into American rock and roll music. And because of that, he sort of leads the town in this kind of rebellion. It goes badly for him and for his girlfriend at the time, who tries to poison herself and is, traumatized and kind of disfigured as a result. And I think the thing that the movie sort of hints at, but maybe doesn't directly come out and say, is this idea that the glorification or even the acceptance of Western culture is totally not allowed. Western culture is seen as decadent and capitalist and the opposite of everything that Soviet society wants to embrace. So I think the Soviet Union early on felt the same way about cinema, is they wanted to create a type of cinema that would be the opposite of the decadent West. And so the sorts of films that would be shown and celebrated in Hollywood that, glamorize things like wealth and upper class status symbols, you're not going to find any of those in socialist realist cinema. And you also, in the early films, you don't even see any citizens who are characters. The characters are basically all communist, socialist, everyman types that Varikin here is really a late variation of. But a lot of the plots are all about how they overcome obstacles by using their Soviet values, and that's why they make great citizens and how they're going to help create this entirely new society. But I would say that this is the most rigid and conservative in the 40s and 50s. And after Stalin dies, there's a little bit more freedom and a little bit more flexibility. But this is something that's really, really slow to come throughout the development of Soviet cinema. And you start to get films like something I mentioned, like The Cranes Are Flying, which is from 57, Ballad of a Soldier, which is from a couple years later in 59. These are movies that were only possible after Stalin's death, and by our current standards probably don't seem too wild or too transgressive, but they were definitely a sign of growth and variation from the early socialist realist films, which didn't want to look at any of what I might call dark subject matter. They didn't want to explore this idea that maybe some people are unhappy. And maybe things like going to war and forcing your citizens to live a certain way and the crushing poverty associated with a lot of Soviet life is something that's negatively impacting citizens. And so it's almost like every decade there are certain themes that become acceptable to explore. So it gradually moves away from those really conservative early socialist realism films. Because obviously something like Zerograd is super far away from that and is so different. But as I was saying earlier, this look at society as not being perfect and people dealing with all of these different issues is something that couldn't be explored in full really until the 80s. But you also have to keep in mind that despite those restrictions and those limitations, you have directors at Mosfilm who are making some of the most important films of the 20th century. People like Dziga Vertov, and as I said earlier, Sergei Eisenstein and Andrei Tarkovsky. Parajanov would make some important films, although there was a delay in releasing them because of censorship issues. But by the 80s, as I said earlier, you have this sort of different idea about censorship within the Soviet government because of perestroika. And this idea that, okay, maybe Soviet society can be a little bit more open to things and embrace the West more, partly as a way to combat the fact that their economy was just utterly failing. And so because of this period of permissiveness, you start to see different kinds of films. Like one of the examples that I mentioned is Vladimir Menshov, who plays the prosecutor here, who made this film that's a pretty good example of what I'm talking about, which is called Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears. You have this whole movement of film noir-like movies, movies like Little Vera, which start to include some sexual content, science fiction allegories. like Kinzaza, also Come and See from a couple years before this in 1985, which I think is the greatest war film ever made, but is a harrowing film that is extremely difficult to watch and is really critical of not just the way that Nazi forces really made the area of Belarus a horrific place to live during the period, but also the way the Soviet Union kind of plays into this warmongering and brutalizing people. Similarly, you have The Cold Summer of 1953, which is about, people being persecuted under Stalin. And so this movie, I think you can draw a clear line from those early films through to some of those changes that come in the 80s that allow artists and filmmakers to be more critical of the way that Soviet society was. And that's why this has some great elements, not just of absurdist comedy and this kind of satire that pokes fun at Soviet society, but these very real, affecting scenes of surrealism and I would even say kind of psychological horror that really leave you guessing as to what direction the film is going to go in. Is this going to become some sort of Kafka-esque story like The Trial, where his life is ruined and he's sort of forced to kill himself or forced to admit this guilt that doesn't actually exist at all? And it doesn't go in that direction, but at this sort of middle point here, it very much seems like Zerograd is going to be talked into more and more things by the prosecutor, and also, as we'll come to see later, he sort of gets talked into things by the townspeople, but it seems like the reason he agrees to some of that is out of this sense of maybe sympathy and not any kind of twisted horror movie plot where, these small town weirdos are revealed to be secretly violent. They're just kind of benign weirdos who are a really interesting example of this sort of remote small town who just sort of seems to thrive on their own legends, their own distortions of history. And so in a way, some of these characters are likable. Even the prosecutor is shown to be kind of this aberration of what you might think of as this kind of standard Soviet lawmaker or person upholding the law. I think this is also part of what feels so Kafka-esque about it to me, is the way that he has these increasing interactions with people in this town who all seem to follow this kind of same logic where nothing really makes sense to Zerograd, certainly. And I think nothing makes sense because they all accept this kind of warped version of history, especially the town history. And it all seems to kind of stem back to this past event where the chef was so fascinated with rock and roll that he kind of brought it to this town dance hall, or at least celebrated it more than anyone else. And that's something that you see in so many of Kafka's stories, is this idea that the fish out of water protagonist is put into this small town with people who do things and say things and believe things that don't make a whole lot of sense to him. And they will sometimes openly admit, yes, this doesn't make any sense, but this is just the way it is. Or yes, this thing is inconvenient or illogical, but that's just how it's done here. And usually that sense of disorder and disruption and illogical foundations of the way that a particular small society is run give the protagonist these feelings of anxiety, sometimes outright fear, claustrophobia, that they're trapped in this world and they don't really understand the rules of how it functions. You definitely see those things here, but they're not quite, as I was saying, as scary or as foreboding or ominous as in some of Kafka's stories or even some of the other absurdist horror tales. And I think some of that is, again, he really is exasperated at what's going on, but because none of it is too wildly out of the realm of plausibility, he goes along with things. Like here, he agrees to, if someone asks him, someone around town asks him, he agrees to say that he is the chef's long lost son, even though he doesn't believe it to be true and says, I just showed up here. I haven't met anyone. I've never seen this man before. And it's never really explained why the chef has a picture of him with a different name on it. And he really, I think, you don't see any cops. There's never any mention that the police are going to kind of hold him in some sort of cell if he tries to leave. So some of it is he's kind of agreeing and going along with it to be imprisoned in a sense, and you do start to get the sense, especially around this point in the film, that he will not be able to leave this town or will have a very difficult time doing so. But instead of the more traditional Kafkaesque stories where the outsider is shown to be some kind of threat or disruptor to town order, he becomes this sort of figure of fascination. I mean, he gets this call on the phone from these young women who want to party with him and, feed him dumplings. And the writer, who is kind of a town celebrity, one of the town elders, wants to talk to him and treats him like he's this person of importance. And he does wind up kind of becoming weirdly famous in this small town. And it definitely, I think, is a plot device that mostly has a humorous function. But it also, like I said, it sort of leaves you guessing about where this plot could possibly go. Because at this point in the film, even though he's being held there, he's agreed to it, and it doesn't feel like he's in any kind of danger of violence. Like, there's no personal risk to him. He's just very confused about what's happening and what his role in this world is going to be. And the writer, who's somebody we hear about in the museum, and as I said, is obviously a little bit of a political figure and has some social power within the world of the town, is basically there to kind of ease his fears and be hospitable and kind. But the whole thing, of course, is very strange. And I should note that the writer is played by Oleg Bazalashvili, who's another well-known Soviet and Russian actor with a career in both theater and cinema. He's yet another person who was named People's Artist of the USSR earlier in the 80s. Yet another one who started at the Moscow Art Theater as a student in the 50s and worked with a number of other actors who would become famous in the future, like Yevgeny Yevstigneyev, who, of course, plays the museum tour guide. And he's another one whose career is made up of just some really incredible theatrical performances in a lot of great adaptations of Russian literature, Tolstoy, Chekhov, so on and so forth. And he had a pretty close relationship working with this director named Eldar Ryazanov, who also made a lot of comedies and satires in the 70s and into the 80s, things like Office Romance and Station for Two. And those would go on into the 90s with films like Promised Heaven, where I think he was able, again, because of perestroika and then the fall of the Soviet Union, was able to get more and more satirical. And he also repeatedly worked with Sheikh Nazarov, not just in Zero City, but also in that film Courier that I mentioned, and Dreams, which is another satire about Soviet cinema. And here, basically, this part of the story does have this kind of surreal tone because the writer is explaining to him about this key event in the past that was a critical moment in the chef's life. And the way the whole thing plays out to us is it's not just that these two men are sitting at a table and one is telling the other a story. It's he turns on this small little black and white TV and is showing him the events of the past as if they've been recorded for television, which is great, which is such a kind of whimsical way to segue into this flashback sequence. And this scene involves a lot of what I was talking about earlier around the way that there's this conflict between an interest in American culture and a disallowal of it within Soviet life. So pop music, rock and roll, definitely the influence of American culture overall was something forbidden, but very attractive to teenagers and young people as this symbol of individuality and freedom and rebellion. And I think in a funny way, the US government really played into this. And the State Department, I think, part of their kind of Cold War propaganda objective was to try to appeal to Soviet citizens, especially younger people, to show them that, you know, the US is this wonderful place. We have all these artists and musicians. And in the 60s and into the 70s, I think there's this way of promoting jazz music as being symbolic of kind of paradise within the US, that, you know, there's no racism and there's no inequality and everyone's just here having a good time, being successful and prosperous, listening to this great music. And while that, of course, was not in any way true, I think this idea of perception and propaganda is so important to the way the Cold War played out, with these two competing ideologies trying to prove that each one is the best way for a society to function. Of course, in a lot of ways, they both failed. But it's just sort of fascinating to see this look at a past influence and a past fascination in the Soviet world with this fascination with American music play out in this film. And that element of, you know, the dance party that you're seeing does have a touch of the carnivalesque, which I think is a big function of surrealist cinema, definitely some absurdist cinema as well. This idea that in these kind of dances and parties and festivals, people are able to put down their masks of restraint and civility and let loose and kind of get wild and let out their sort of inner urges and longings. And obviously, this sequence, you know, they don't go too wildly over the top in that flashback. But just the idea of dancing so exuberantly to American rock and roll clearly has its consequences, which we're seeing reflected, you know, decades later in the plot of this film, where these people still seem to want to have a good time and party and dance to this music. And it's really taken a shift because we're, you know, decades later in Soviet life and things have changed so much. And I do think this could count as a key example of absurdist cinema in the 80s, definitely cinema of the Kafkaesque, which really begins with 19th century writers like Kafka, but also a lot of other absurdists that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and really takes shape during World War II and during the beginning of the Cold War, especially in its transition from literature to cinema. And I think a lot of the writers in this particular kind of loose movement focus on the horror of existence in a meaningless, sort of purposeless universe where the rules of society are arbitrary but kind of rigidly enforced in weird ways. Sexuality feels very threatening, and certainly a lot has been written about the ways that women are given these very narrow roles in Kafka's stories, which of course is also expressed in cinema, like Orson Welles' adaptation of The Trial, for example. And there's also this sense of guilt everywhere that you don't quite see so much in Zerograd, as if it's moved on a little bit beyond that point, but generally in a lot of absurdist literature and cinema, you have these characters who are just desperate to survive, and because of that need to survive, they wind up feeling kind of cold and shallow and selfish, or just very, very strange and willing to kind of accept these bizarre rules and strange versions of society just so that they can live their day-to-day lives. I think some of these stories are also about individuals who are totally fed up with this environment and push back against it. You definitely see a little bit of that in Zerograd in his attempts to escape, but just things like The Trial and The Castle, where the protagonist is basically the victim of this kind of insane bureaucracy and try to get out from underneath its oppressive fist. Also things like, a really key early example is this Melville story called Bartleby the Scrivener from the 1850s, where this law clerk, who is a similar version of this sort of everyday civil servant protagonist, he just can't deal with bureaucracy anymore, and anytime he's asked to do something, even totally reasonable things, he refuses in this strangely polite, passive kind of way, where he just says, "I would prefer not to everything." And a lot of these stories really are about the way that bureaucracy is unnecessarily maddening and is set up to make people fail, so that you're just kind of forever going around and around in this loop of red tape. And you definitely see that a little bit in Zerograd, where he's trying to get this equipment at the beginning of the film, and it sort of seems like it's going to work out, but it's going to take a long time and be sort of difficult. But then when he tries to leave town, it's just unnecessarily difficult for him to do so, and he is in this sort of loop where by now he can't, not only can he seem to not be able to escape and get on the train back to Moscow, but he also has gotten sucked into their world and is tricked or forced into pretending to be the chef's son. So much like what they do with the museum, where they try to apply global history to their town and vice versa, it sort of seems like there's this drive to make everything fit into their reality. And that's definitely what they do with Barakin's character, where he's a complete stranger and yet somehow he becomes an integral part of the town's history. And during this scene, at least, he seems to enjoy it. Of course, the prosecutor is not having any of this, and in what I think is the most nightmarish scene of the film, he gives this speech where he doesn't want anyone to kind of celebrate rock music. He doesn't want anyone to honor the memory of the chef, and is obsessed with this idea that the chef didn't commit suicide, not because he has some other sort of valid motivation for murder, but it seems like he's trying to argue that suicide is this valorous act that requires a lot of strength and fortitude. And basically he's saying the chef is too weak, and he'll show you how it's really done. But of course he gets up there, and with everyone watching, his gun doesn't work. no matter how many times he tries to shoot himself. And it's just kind of such a horrifyingly dark moment that also winds up being really funny, but also kind of pathetic at the same time. And certainly one of the key themes of absurdism is this idea that ordinary citizens are powerless in this world. This world has no meaning, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're just sort of trapped by the state, whether the state is capitalist or communist, or, whether it's before World War One or during World War Two. There's this sense that even though everything is meaningless, that doesn't mean that you can kind of kick back and relax and just enjoy your godless existence. It means that you're stuck in these increasingly surreal, nonsensical social paradigms. And you definitely see that here. There's also this very real sense that these types of spaces, especially public spaces like office buildings and courthouses, are really sort of terrifying and claustrophobic. People feel like they're being crowded or closed in upon. And I see that a little bit in this dance sequence as well. And there's an interesting parallel between something like Zerograd and an earlier film from the 70s, Bertolucci's The Conformist, where you have this character who's so passive and has no identity, and all he wants to do is fit in. And the best way for him to fit in is to join up with this fascist group who, and it's an Italian film that's set around the time of World War II. So he joins up with them because they have the most political power, and he just desperately wants to belong and fit in somewhere. But he's also at this dance hall sequence, and these characters start this kind of spiralized conga line dance that just begins to crush in on him. And I think that is definitely something evocative of absurdism, but it also definitely reminds me a little bit of a darker version of this scene in Zerograd, where he's this outsider, and he's not really at risk of violence, but at the same time, it's a strange place, and you never really know how anyone's going to believe. Because people definitely are following their own motivations, and part of what's so harrowing about a lot of absurdist tales is you get this idea that people aren't always overtly unfriendly. They're just not really interested in any kind of communal supportive structure. They're in it for themselves, and they'll help you maybe if it amuses them or it conveniences them in some way. But in general, they just kind of want to do their own thing and maybe make you fit into their narrative. And that's definitely something that I think happens in Zerograd. And it's also interesting if you think about it in the development of narratives like novels, especially first-person novels that are structured around a key protagonist. And most of the story involves the way other characters impact that protagonist. Whereas in absurdist tales, the protagonist is really at the mercy of other people, and they're not really the hero of their own story. They're just kind of swept along. That's definitely something that you see in Zerograd, is everyone seems to think that they're the protagonist of the story. Like the conflict between Verikin's character and the prosecutor, who has all of these ideas about what's actually going on with this death and in his town. And Verikin seems to admit that he has no idea what's going on, but is just kind of gonna roll with it, maybe even out of a sense of self-preservation. But going back a little bit to the crowd scene that I mentioned, and so now this third act of Zerograd, and definitely the final 10 or 15 minutes, there's this interesting shift where he becomes sort of a figure of the town. They treat him like he's their property in a weird way. And this sort of starts to happen when the writer requests a meeting with him. But, he doesn't invite any of these people to his hotel room. They just all show up and seem to kind of have decided to take him into their society. They all introduce themselves. You've got, the mayor and all of these sort of important town elders. And in a way, this definitely does kind of remind me of things like The Conformist and other absurdist films and stories, because you do get this sense, especially in something like Kafka's The Trial, this sense that the protagonist is being watched and has somehow caught the attention of either state or government forces or just other people in the town who now are watching everything that this person is doing. And while it's definitely friendlier in Zerograd than it is in something like The Trial and The Castle and other works of existentialist absurdist literature, there is something kind of creepy about it. Like, they've just decided you no longer have your own personal space or your own identity. We're just kind of folding you into our social structure because we've decided that you have this particular identity. And in the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, this writer, Chris Baldick, talks about the absurd as, coming from French existential philosophy as written by people like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, but talks about the way in which purposelessness in this universe without God, without meaning, or without value becomes this really terrifying, unfathomable place that really is exemplified by Kafka. And he writes, it's the sort of place in which characters face alarmingly incomprehensible predicaments. Existentialism and purposelessness feature strongly as key concepts. And this applies to a lot of other writers from the 1850s onward. Not just Sartre and Camus, but also Samuel Beckett, and even earlier than that, there are a lot of Russian writers involved that I'm sure have had more influence on this film than someone like Kafka, who's Czech. People like Chekhov and Dostoevsky and Gogol, who I mentioned. If you aren't as familiar with Gogol, he wrote this story called The Nose that's really influential to absurdist literature. It definitely influenced Kafka. Dostoevsky's The Double is another great example that is about this sort of bureaucratic everyman who sees a double of himself, who starts to do all of these things that really embarrass him and cause him all this anxiety. And there are also more recent works that I think you can draw a connection to this film from. Things like Roland Topper's The Tenant, which Roman Polanski also made a film adaptation of. And in a way, The Tenant is almost kind of a nightmare version of Zerograd, because you have this guy who is a foreigner in Paris. He's, Polish, has this accent, but in his mind is not a foreigner at all, but to them he is. And he's trying to find a new apartment to rent, which is very difficult. There are all of these unspoken rules in this apartment building that he moves into, and everyone is kind of cold and abrupt to him. And if he makes any noise at all, they complain about it and make a huge deal and act like he's just this sort of nightmare tenant. And ultimately, he comes to learn about the woman who lived in the apartment before him who killed herself. And he feels like the other tenants are kind of subtly coercing him to transform into her. And while there are very funny scenes in The Tenant, it's definitely a horror novel and a horror film. in a way that Zerograd is not. But I think the echoes are in the way that Verikin just sort of allows himself to be transformed into the chef's son. Even though he says, I've never met this man, I have a father, I live far away in Moscow, I've never been here. When they say, you know what, okay, just agree with it, go along with it, give a speech about him at this public event, he seems to be sort of coerced into acting like he's the chef's son, or maybe even believing it. And I think absurdist literature talks a lot about the atrocities of the 20th century, things like World War I and World War II and the Holocaust, the Cold War, atomic terror, and things like that. And there are a lot of critics and academics who read absurdist literature as a response to life under totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. And so you definitely see a rich tradition of Russian and Czech and other Eastern European writers who kind of spearheaded this movement, which is why I think it's so impossible to talk about Zerograd without also mentioning a lot of them as well. Definitely Gogol and Dostoevsky, who I talked about, who wrote their kind of essential absurdist stories in the middle of the 19th century, but also Polish writers like Bruno Schulz and Witold Gombrowicz. There are other Russians that I think are important who aren't as well known, like Daniel Karms, who fold together this sense of existential horror and absurdist comedy with a lot of social satire. And one of the ways that I think this film really differs from some of those absurdist writers is in the way that it's lighter. So a lot of those writers, certainly not all of them, but a lot of them were Jewish and have been connected to this idea of Jewish humor and the way that satire is presented in Jewish culture. And also, a lot of their novels and stories are seen as a reflection of the experience of the persecution of Jews in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries in Eastern Europe and Europe more broadly during World War II. This, I don't think, has nearly as much of that, and I think feels more comedic and more lighthearted. There's definitely also a Western and Southern European influence, thanks to directors like Fellini and Buñuel, who definitely influenced Shekhnazarov, and he's spoken about that in interviews. Also, Bulgakov, who wrote things like The Master and the Margarita, who I mentioned, which when Bulgakov was writing, he was a real thorn in the side of Soviet society. A lot of his work was banned or censored, but, he's become just a classic, celebrated writer. And also, before we move on from this scene, I did just want to mention the mayor character, who becomes such a strong force in the very final scene of the film here. He's played by an actor named Pyotr Sherbakov, who, yet again, is another person named People's Artist of the USSR in the early 80s, with a great long career in film and theater. He's in some early 60s classics like I Am 20, and wound up working with Shekhnazarov frequently in the 80s and into the 90s. And before we get too close to the end here, I did also just want to mention some of the other people involved in the production, like Alexander Borodyansky, who co-wrote the film with Shekhnazarov. He's a well-known Soviet and Russian director and writer. He worked on a lot of Mosfilm comedies and musicals before teaming up with Shekhnazarov to write a number of films. Likewise, another important regular collaborator is Nikolai Nemelyev, who did the gorgeous cinematography on this film. And again, to call back to something I said earlier, these nighttime forest sequences just give off such wonderful, eerie fairy tale vibes. And this really is a beautiful film that, like I said before, in a lot of ways reminds me of a musical in the ways that this idea of visual spectacle is tied so closely to the narrative and this idea around the distorted historical narrative. Of course, a lot of the atmosphere also comes from the wonderful score from Eduard Artemyev, who's known for doing the scores on things like Solaris and Stalker. And the great production design is from Lyudmila Kosakova, and costumes are from Vera Romanova. And I think, they all look absolutely wonderful. And again, just as we're kind of getting close to the end of the film here, and there's this very strange, almost kind of neo-pagan folk horror sequence where all these prominent town members travel from his hotel room out to this very ancient tree that has symbolic importance, and it almost seems like some sort of sacrifice is about to take place. But again, I can't stress enough how closely tied this film is to its particular time and place, even though it does feel so strangely relevant. And a lot of that is because of Mikhail Gorbachev and the way that he changed the Soviet Union in the mid-80s thanks to Perestroika, which I've talked about, this revitalization of the Soviet economy, or at least the attempted revitalization. Glasnost is another one that I think a lot of people have heard about, in which there's this turnover in terms of what censorship was like that allowed there to be more governmental reforms, more freedom of speech, more attempts to work with outside countries that previously the Soviet Union ignored or refused to work with. But I think it just reached a point where there was no way forward that government officials could find. There was just this, huge stagnation. And Brezhnev, who ruled from 64 to 82, so just before this, his reign is sort of called the era of stagnation, where there's just almost no economic growth that of course leads directly to this period. And so you reach this place where things just have no meaning anymore. And as I said, I think there are so many alarming parallels to today that this film reminds me of, especially Russian society and Russian government today. But, you get this sense that Verikin is, being kind of quiet and meek throughout most of the film, but is terrified by this idea that, the past and the present and fact and truth don't have any real meaning and just get sort of spun into these strange, fantastical narratives in this world where people just kind of distort history and truth to be whatever they want, whatever sounds good to them. And I love that the one who really recognizes this is crazy and you should get away from it, this is the prosecutor, who's sort of set up as the antagonist in a weird way. And so he encourages Verikin to run away. Not that we really think he could run all the way back to Moscow, but he's able to sort of flee out into this forest. And I just love that we get this final shot of the museum here, just kind of hammering home what it means to this town and what they think of the world and their place in it and their place in history. And it's definitely a dark ending. There is a sense of hope here because he's fleeing out into the forest at dawn. And of course, dawn almost always symbolizes some sort of hope or positivity on the horizon in so many films. But this sense of surrealism, I think, becomes accentuated really in the third act as it starts to move further and further away from this sense of stability and reality, and the world just becomes very hard to understand. And I think part of why he runs away in terror is because he sees how easy it is for him to get sucked into it. And I love this absolutely beautiful kind of pastel, purple, and peach tinted image of him standing on this boat by himself, floating into the lake. He doesn't have any oars. It seems like he's not going anywhere, and like his attempts to get out of town aren't really going to be successful. He's just going to be kind of stuck there, drifting on the water until somebody from the town wanders along and finds him and brings him back. And so this really ambiguous ending, I think, is the perfect way to conclude a film like this that sort of straddles all these different genres, thriller and mystery and surrealist, absurdist comedy. And it really, I can't keep stressing enough, is very strange to watch it now in the way that it is a distinct product from a time and place. And it helps to know a lot of this political historical context to fully understand the film. But it also feels so alarmingly relevant. And so I'm really glad that it's gotten such a beautiful restoration, and hopefully a new generation of film fans will become better acquainted with late Soviet cinema and with this great work of absurdist cinema. While I think also thinking a lot about the way that warping history and reality has such a terrifying impact on society as a whole, and how it leads to things like the first major war in Europe in decades.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.